This is Dr. William Watson of the Duffy's Cut Project. The film you're about to see is entitled The Cut, The Journey of the Men and Women of Duffy's Cut. It's the most comprehensive film rendering of the story of Duffy's Cut. Duffy's Cut is where 57 Irish immigrant railroad workers died in the summer of 1832 of murder and cholera building Pennsylvania's pioneering railroad. To date, the remains of 7 of those workers have been excavated, and we have another 50 sets of remains to be excavated. For more information about the film and to support the project, please visit IrishAmericanFilms.com and Duffy'sCut.immaculata.edu. Thank you.
We're here at Duffy's Cut in Malvern, PA, where 57 Irish railroad workers who were recently immigrated from Ireland perished in 1832 and were subsequently thrown into a fill of unmarked graves in close proximity to the railroad line that they were constructing. 138 years later, the railroad line went bankrupt and death records were discovered that set off a series of events that culminated in an 8-year anthropological dig to find the remains of the Irish Duffy's Cut railroad workers that perished in 1832. The main purpose of this dig was to exhume their remains, find out what really happened to them, and start the process of securing their remains, burying them properly, or sending them home to rest in their native soil in Ireland.
This is a story of Irish history and murder. The remains of 5 Irish immigrants who arrived in Pennsylvania in the early 1800s were finally buried today.
Irish immigrants and railroad workers buried in mass graves on the main line back in the 1800s after dying from disease, and others were possibly murdered.
The funeral procession at West Laurel Hill Cemetery marked the end of a 180-year journey for 4 men and 1 woman, part of a group of Irish immigrants that died in 1832 working on the railroad at Duffy's Cut.
Bill, tell me where the journey started for the men and women of Duffy's Cut.
Well, the province of Ulster is where the majority of the crew came from at Duffy's Cut. And at that time, of course, it was controlled by Britain, several centuries, of
Right.
British control. You add the element of the Reformation in after the year 1500, and Protestantism, among the elite. It's called the Protestant ascendancy is on the scene. So the men and women at Duffy's Cut came from an environment where they were essentially second-class citizens, and a minority ruled over a majority based on religion. And very few economic opportunities, very few political opportunities, although in 1829 the vote was allowed for the Catholic population, but economically, they were at the bottom of the entire hierarchy. And so there just weren't jobs available for them except working on farms, producing the potatoes for absentee British landlords. They paid their rent in the form of potatoes for a small bit of land for themselves, the subsistence living basically. Basically, I would say like medieval serfs living as it would have been for the past 1,000 years.
Well, for Irish laborers in their homeland, it would have been a very difficult time in the 1830s. We know for a fact that, if you didn't inherit land, if you didn't have land, that you didn't have a chance in Ireland at this time.
Farming areas, agricultural areas, it was a medieval lifestyle and timeline, and these were guys farming in a method that would have been something you'd see in the 1400s when it was fiefdom, feudal society, but this is the 1830s. In America, it's much more industrialized. They're moving hundreds of years as well as moving hundreds of miles.
We have a great deal of immigration that comes in the 1830s. A great deal of folks travel from the west and the north of Ireland to come to America for some sort of economic chance, some economic opportunity. We know that families would help to save up to send a loved one to America, and when they sent them off on the ships to come to the New World, that they came with all their hopes and their dreams. We know that sometimes they brought very little with them. If we look at the John Stamp Ship Register, it tells us what folks in this period would have brought with them. Some of them brought nothing. Many of them brought nothing whatsoever, but the clothes on their back. Others brought a cask, or others brought a satchel. Some brought, a few brought trunks, and they had some of their worldly goods with them. But they brought very little, in terms of their worldly possessions, their worldly goods. They came with their memories of their homeland, the stories and the songs that upheld them in their identity as Irish people, and they brought their religion. And that was another thing that would have driven them from Ireland, was the fact that if you were a Catholic Irishman, you really didn't have a lot to hope for. Your property wouldn't be yours, if you didn't inherit it. If you were one of the younger sons, you were out of luck. And so you came to America hoping to make as much as 50 cents a day, and the railroad lured them over with 50 cents a day and as much whiskey as you could drink. And so they came with the hope that life would be better here.
What were some of the indignities that the Irish faced when they came over to America in the 1800s?
The same indignities that they faced the country that they left. Had to get out of there because discrimination, lack of work. When you talk about the famine, which should not have happened, and signs all over the place that no Irish need apply. You can't really think much about that until you would actually see it. I mean, you walk up to a doorway with help wanted and no Irish need apply. That's terrible. But that's what they fought.
They traveled on the ocean. It was up to a 2-month voyage.
They left from the port of Derry in a bark, which was a ship that really would have been about 60 feet, give or take. And you're looking at them taking a 2-month journey at something about the third of the size of a football field, all of these people. It would have been cramped living space. Eventually they come to Philadelphia.
They landed at what was called the Lazaretto, which was basically a screening facility to make sure you didn't arrive with a disease. And we know for a fact that the John Stamp, the ship that brought our laborers to America, came with no one sick on board.
Ports along the east coast of the United States at this time were fearful that there would be an epidemic arriving in the country. So Philadelphia, like a lot of other cities, ended up having a quarantine station outside the city before the port, of arrival, to make sure that anyone who was ill on a ship would be offloaded and quarantined, and then the ship would pull into port with a presumably healthy complement of passengers. And it wasn't uncommon, other cities had it too. We called it the Lazaretto here outside of Philadelphia. And it was in Tinicum, right, in Delaware County. I don't know how many miles outside of the port of Philadelphia, but, it was a place that they felt was safe, that if there were people who were diseased, they'd be offloaded. So the John Stamp in 1832 pulled in there in June prior to its arrival in Philadelphia. And one of the important things is that we know from research done by Professor David Barnes at the University of Pennsylvania that there was no one on our ship, the John Stamp, who was ill. The ship left port in Derry in April of 1832 and it pulled in Philadelphia in June. Imagine a 6-week voyage. Pretty arduous in and of itself, but everyone on that ship was healthy when it reached the port. So our guys were not the cause of the contagion in Chester County. They caught it when they were here.
They would land in the port of Philadelphia, which was the largest port of entry in America at this time.
We're here at the Port of Philadelphia, where the Duffy's Cut crew arrived after departing the Lazaretto quarantine station in Tinicum. It was here that they met Philip Duffy and began their perilous journey out to Duffy's Cut. Bill, tell me what happened when the Duffy's Cut crew left the Lazaretto quarantine station.
Well, they sailed a short distance down the Delaware to the port of Philadelphia, and on the docks would have been met by Philip Duffy. You know, the railroad contractors, canal contractors all had word that ships of Irish workers are arriving, and Duffy would have had someone, to alert him that the ship was on its way. So he took him right off the docks and right on out, probably a day's journey to mile 59 out in Malvern.
Philip Duffy is a character with an interesting focus. Some people think a little better of him, some people think a little worse. When he passed away, he was listed as a gentleman. He made a fair amount of money. He started not very big, and he would have been working under people that even with the levels he reached would have looked down on him. He never would have been part of their class, of their society, no matter how much he made. And he really threw his patronymic under the bus, is the way a lot of us look at it. He may have met the same fate if he had spoken up and did something at the time of these men's murders, but you see him get out of Dodge immediately after. And through the rest of his life, it's not something he talks about, it's not something he reaches out to the families of these men. Not long after, he's hiring other dig crews, right after. So at the moment, he probably didn't have the opportunity to help, but as time went on, he probably did, and he never did anything. And the irony of that goes full circle with where we buried our guys and what was known as Philip Duffy's grave. But as an individual, we don't know much about him. Past a certain point, he had no male descendants, and it's a question of what he did do, but what he could have done. And while he was looked down upon by his superiors in the railroad, he didn't do anything to help his fellow patriotsman, an Irishman, going forward. So he's an opportunist. He climbs up the ladder in industrial America the way a lot of people did, and he leaves some people behind him.
Bill, explain to me what was taking place at the time that the Duffy's Cut crew arrived in Philadelphia.
Well, there are loads of industrial projects getting underway at that time, all along the eastern seaboard of the United States. And Philadelphia is one of the leading places where such activity was going on. The state had actually approved a budget for something called the Main Line of Public Works a couple years earlier, and they're building this rail line combined with a canal system to make Philadelphia and Pittsburgh linked up within 3 to 4 days instead of 3 to 4 weeks like it had been before. And the Irish are really huge in that endeavor. There were Irish contractors who would have met shiploads of their fellow countrymen at the docks and taken them to work sites. And Philip Duffy, we know, did this with our crew at Duffy's Cut. He'd already had contracts with the railroad prior to this time. He was a purveyor of his countrymen and a well-known purveyor of labor for the railroad by that time. And he would have contracts stretching all the way through 1849 with this railroad, and contracts also with the Reading Railroad and the Westchester Railroad. So he was good at what he did. It's just what he did wasn't such a nice thing, purveying his countrymen to their doom at Duffy's Cut. But it wouldn't have been an uncommon thing for Irish contractors at this time to have, in the social network that existed in the city at that time, to have some pretty good knowledge base of who was coming over, what counties they were from. And it probably made a lot of sense for him to have met this ship, because we believe he came from Ulster as well. 2 years previous to this, Duffy had been in the newspapers at the nearby mile 60 for problems along the line between the work crews. What the railroad needed, of course, is the ability to do backbreaking labor, ideal cannon fodder for the Industrial Revolution. And the newspaper called them the sturdy-looking band of the Sons of Erin. Duffy was already well on his way to becoming a rich man by this time, and this contract at Mile 59 was the most expensive of any mile in the 82-mile system. Over $23,000 in the official contract. It would stretch out to almost $10,000 more by the time it was actually done after the death of our crew, whereas the typical mile only cost about $4,000 to complete. So this was really, probably the biggest industrial endeavor in the state of Pennsylvania at that time that our guys were brought out to do.
So the Irishmen arrive at Duffy's Cut. What would have been some of the living and working conditions that they initially experienced when they got there?
Well, the trip from Philadelphia to the spot at Mile 59 would have probably been about a day's journey, probably by Conestoga wagon, probably out Route 30. We don't believe that our fellow Irishmen at that time had any experiences in the city other than to see it from a Conestoga wagon. I mean, there were Irish pubs in existence, there were Irish neighborhoods in existence, but these guys wouldn't have had any opportunity to interact with that world at that time. They probably were exhausted already from the ocean voyage, and then they've got another day's travel to get out to the work site. Right. Wearing clothing that would have been appropriate for Ireland in the summer of 1832, but not necessarily for Pennsylvania. What we know is that from diaries that existed at the time, that the weather was extremely hot and humid. Probably a 12-hour workday, dawn to dusk, very, very heavy back-breaking labor and clothing that really wasn't appropriate for the climate. And obviously, in an environment largely, that was unchanged from the antiquity kind of construction of the Greeks, Romans, Egyptians, and Mesopotamians, using, sort of simple tools. A stone spike, which is very, very rare as well. Apparently only drawings of this have survived, but in the very beginning days of the railroad, these were used in place of the later iron spikes that we're much more familiar with. They were used to affix the tracks to stone blocks, a very different kind of construction compared to the ties that are used today. And they broke very often, and so they were replaced very, very early on. Again, indicative of the early moment of the railroad. To construct an earthen fill, an earth bridge in lieu of an actual stone bridge, because the railroad didn't want to spend the money on an actual bridge. They were building with something that would have been similar to what the Greeks and Romans built 1,000 years before. To construct their own shanty town. What we're talking about is lean-tos and tents and nothing really permanent, but I'm sure Duffy simply told them, this is where you're going to be living and working, for the next year. And so they probably went right to the task of trying to construct a shanty, with whatever materials Duffy probably provided for them. And it was 20 feet, 30 feet, 50 feet, different spots in the valley from the actual work site where they were going to be constructing the fill. So they were living and working in very close proximity.
In early parts of the railroad, they just started work camps. They actually began with the Erie Canal and early work on the canal systems. But a shanty town or work camp, when we think of shanties, we think of full buildings, but that's not what they had. It was more of a canvas covering to keep the rain out, maybe a little bit of canvas on the sides and an open front. So they were sleeping on the ground. Some of them would have had the basics, even possibly a trunk, a few changes of clothes, if that, their pipes, their Bible, their rosaries, but very little else. They would have been very packed in very tightly. They would have had a cook, possibly an assistant, a blacksmith on hand to take care of their work. And this would have been right at the beginning of the point where we would have seen exploitation, in that the contractors would have started setting up their stores. So now you would have had contractors selling all the goods to our men. So they're paying them and then taking their money right back. So it's just at that point where we see the big exploitation that we're going to see later in the Industrial Revolution of the working class. And it's happening right here at Duffy's Cut.
When they arrived at what became Duffy's Cut, mile 59, we know that they came to an area that was very primitive in many ways. It probably would have been an area similar to what they came from in the north of Ireland at that time, an area where there wasn't a great deal of industry. There were a lot of farms. It was a rural world out there. There was also very little law. The local sheriff was in Westchester, and so it was an area that was, very similar in some ways, but also there was a similarity in terms of the intellectual and the spiritual life as well. It was a highly Protestant community in Chester County, and certainly there would have been, a concern for that these Irish Catholics were coming into their town and into their neighborhood. Even though they lived in a shanty that was basically in the woods at this time, they were surrounded by farms of rich landowners, folks who'd been there for some years, some from Ireland, but also some Germans as well. And there were Quakers in this neighborhood. Our Irish Catholic laborers came in almost as aliens, as foreigners. And so there was a distrust on the part of the farmers and the landowners. And we know that there were struggles and there was turmoil, on the part of the railroad and the community. People would blame, problems with their property on the railroad and on the laborers. There were sometimes fights, and there were things that broke out between the neighbors and the railroad workers, and certainly lawsuits with the railroad at this time. And so this is what our folks walked into when they entered that valley at Duffy's Cut.
The scenario also of the locals, finding probably that, they're in the midst of a hostile environment that would have been not too dissimilar from Ulster at the time, probably shocked a lot of them.
Well, our laborers were living in a shanty. They were in basically a tent city that was in the bottom of a valley. And as they were building the railroad fill, as they were building a man-made mountain, basically, on which the tracks would rest, they were building something that would keep them enclosed, basically helping to keep them in this camp when the quarantine was put in place. We know that eventually they ended up meeting what was called the East Whiteland Horse Company, which was the law in that area. They were chartered by the state of Pennsylvania to bring horse thieves and other breakers of the law to justice.
There are a lot of groups in the United States in the 1830s that provided justice in the absence of a constable. And a lot of these organizations called themselves horse companies. Here in East Whiteland Township in Chester County, it was called the East Whiteland Horse Company. And they were a group of local farmers who ostensibly were organized to prevent the theft of horses, and then to try to find horses if they were stolen, because they were the valuable commodities for farmers at the time. And they were responsible for other aspects of enforcement of the law as well. Any local crimes that might have been committed of another type, they would have been called upon by the local judge, who happened to live right down the road from where Duffy's Cut was, a very short distance, to bring people to justice. And kind of like a gang of vigilantes, basically, is how they would have operated. And these people would have been from the local population.
The groups in Chester County that may have done this, we know descendants, some of them by name, what family. We know what society class. To do this, these guys probably would have had to have some money, be on the upper tier of society then. They worked vigilante, they were kind of above the law. We know the names of the families, but we know the identity persona-wise of these men. We know probably what kind of house they would have owned, what kind of an occupation they would have had. These weren't grunt workers like the guys from Ireland. These guys had a profession, they had a family lineage, and even if we don't know every specific family name, we know the identity that the men in the East Whiteland Horse Company were from. We know they were 99% likely Protestant. There was anti-Catholic sentiment in this area at the time. You can look at films like Gangs of New York and that nativist type transition, unwelcome to immigrants. That's the group that these guys would have been from. We were here first, we are American. These are our jobs, our land, they're coming in, different religion. So they would have been in North America for a time that they would have considered themselves probably superior to these folks, or at the least this was their place, this was their home. But this wasn't the home of these workers. This wasn't the place of these workers. So they were on the inside of the community and these guys were on the outside. But would have had some money, been upper middle class, and influence in the town, politically, legally, financially. All positions that our guys had no say in.
At that time, this was not an entirely Quaker area. There was a lot of Scotch-Irish who settled in, people who would have been of Presbyterian background, and for the Catholics coming in from Ulster, this would have been a somewhat similar social situation than that which they left in places like Donegal or Tyrone or Derry, you know, where the Protestant, Presbyterian, Orange type, you know, Irish dominated the Catholic, poor, green type Irish. And it's like, you know, the scenarios of the marches, you know, around July 12th in commemoration of the victory of William of Orange at Battle of the Boyne. That world is a world that existed in 1832 in Ulster. That is the world that our guys left, coming to the New World to try to get away from. And unfortunately, they landed out here in an area that was very Orange, very Presbyterian, and very conscious of the fact that there weren't many Catholics out here. There was no one to advocate for our guys when the East Whiteland Horse Company would have created a quarantine around that valley, which we know they did. We know the families that were in charge of the horse company had a consciousness of being Orange Irish. We've heard from descendants of people in the organization at the time who confirmed that. And it really would have been a kind of worst case scenario for those guys to have ended up at mile 59 of the Philadelphia and Columbia Railroad as opposed to almost any other mile at that particular time when an epidemic came in, which they could not have possibly, no one understood what was the cause, you know, the consequences of getting it.
And so when they fled, when our men and the women fled the camp as they tried to seek help, they would literally be climbing out of the valley. They'd be climbing up hillsides and crossing farmland of people who were very distrustful and fearful of them. And so they crossed land that was owned by folks who basically would have been scared of them. And so as they sought refuge in homes of neighbors to get help, to be able to have some succor and some assistance in their suffering, we know from the railroad file that they were turned away. They were turned away and they were forced to go elsewhere. If you have disease, if you have this, what was considered to be an incurable disease, if you're a foreigner who may not speak English, if you're an Irish Catholic who's coming to the door of a landed gentry in Chester County, you know, you're looked on as almost a monster, you know. And so what happens is that we know for a fact that they were not only chased away, but there were some, sadly, who were murdered by these folks out of fear, out of hatred for the disease and hatred of the foreigner. And sadly, that's what our men and the women, at least one of the women who was murdered, what they received. They met murder at the hands of those who they sought for help. And so we know, again, somebody was profiting off of the deaths of these men, and it's just a sad part of the story. The prevalence of fear of the disease would have led these folks to, to cover the story up as much as possible, because who would invest in the railroad? The money makers and the decision makers in the Delaware Valley back in the 1830s, were the rich industrialists, and they certainly had very little care for the immigrant laborers who they hired. They would have largely been Protestant. They would have been here for some generations. There might have been some Ulster Irish among them, but certainly, landed folks who had been here for a number of years. Very little concern for the Irish immigrants who came to America. We know that there was anti-Irish sentiment and certainly anti-Catholic sentiment at the time. And among those who made the laws and those who enforced the laws, those who put money into the railroad, very little concern for the Irish community. We know that those who invested in the railroad were very concerned when cholera broke out along the line of the railroad as it was being built. that they claimed in the popular press that they wanted to put up cholera hospitals to care for the workers on the railroad, but we have found no evidence in the archival record of any money going to put up a hospital. Money was taken from the state, money was allocated, but no money went for any hospital that we've ever located at any site on the railroad.
So when cholera hit the camp, what was the impact to the Duffy's Cut crew?
Well, someone clearly nearby excreted into the stream. The springs for that stream are very close to the work site, so it would have been someone in the local community. One by one, members of the crew got ill. They would have started convulsing, vomiting, diarrhea, putting on the aspects kind of the living dead.
Right. There was cholera in the United States prior to 1830. But in 1830, Asiatic cholera had come out of India, and it spread across Russia into Eastern Europe, across all of Europe, and it would finally, in about early 1831, the cholera had hit Ireland itself. Now we have evidence that it came to North America via Canada, and unfortunately for our men, every 3 days in the local papers, they had a cholera article, and that article told them exactly where the cholera was, and it went from Ireland and Great Britain across to Canada, down into Boston, New York, Philadelphia. So these people, the locals that our men were interacting with, had for about a year been warned that this deadly disease was coming. And the dread, they had no idea how it could be spread. They were losing between 4 and 6 individuals who caught cholera died. So it was a terrible, terrible thing. And they spent a whole year just building up the dread. So when our men came down with cholera, it was a perfect situation for mass murder. They were so afraid of the cholera that our guys being Irish, our guys being immigrants, and then some of them having cholera, they weren't ever going to leave that valley. They were going to be forced to stay there until they all died, and that's exactly what happened.
Probably, causing a lot of fear and panic in the camp, saying, "Oh my God, how did this disease arrive in our midst?" And so we know that some of the first individuals who were able to get out did get out of the valley. 6, 7 individuals flee the valley and are looking for help from the local population. Doors are closed to them. And what the railroad file says is that they were forced to go back into the valley. Now, we know from the physical evidence that some of those individuals were murdered. The first 7 bodies we excavated were showing signs of murder.
Because we know that our folks had cholera in the work camp, and as they fled our shanty at Duffy's Cut, that they took cholera with them. And so, sad to say, the deaths at Duffy's Cut influenced a number of others, and there were a number of other deaths because our men caught cholera as well.
The fact of the matter is, there are 2 other sites that are mass graves in Downingtown and Spring City that we haven't even had a chance to explore yet.
This cholera epidemic and other cholera epidemics, we're unique in that we're one of the first stories that found the men and gave them a burial, but we're not unique in this being a story. It happens at canal workers' graves, it happens at other rail workers' graves.
We're here at the East Vincent Mennonite Cemetery in Spring City, Pennsylvania, where yet another mass grave of immigrant Irish workers is located. Frank, could you tell us a little bit about this grave?
Yes, this grave is actually of canal workers from the same time period that the men died at Duffy's Cut, from the early 1830s, 1832. This was a group of laborers who was working on a canal. They were working for what was called the Schuylkill Navigation Company, and it was just part of the main line of public works, canal and rail links from across the state.
And what's amazing, obviously, is that you have so many casualties from the epidemic among the immigrant work crews in the same county from the same time. And we know, certainly in the case of Duffy's Cut, that some of those individuals were murdered, possibly, the worst mass murder in Pennsylvania history.
Right.
Spring City is another mass grave site, and we know that there were Irish laborers all through that area working on building the railroad. And so in terms of the spread of the disease, we know that folks who had the disease left Duffy's Cut. It ended up going through Downingtown eventually, we believe, into Spring City. And the mass grave that is located there would also be a site where there were folks who caught this disease and were left untreated and were buried in unmarked graves. And so we know that we'll be able to locate these sites because of popular folklore telling us that there are areas here that were not touched. Folks did not disturb cholera graves. There was a fear that you would unearth the disease if you unearthed the bodies. And that persisted for decades after the deaths, at least of our men we know, at Duffy's Cut.
Frank, tell me what's unique about the orientation of the tombstones around the mass grave here at the East Vincent Mennonite Cemetery.
What's unique about this is that we actually have a clear demarcation of this area, that this was almost set up so that no one would be buried in this spot. If you could see, there are tombstones facing in, so the head would be literally where the headstone is, and the feet in this direction. And if you look on the other side, it's the same way. The headstones are facing in. The head would be on the side where the headstone is, and the feet facing in. And so we have a very kind of an aberration here in terms of the orientation of bodies in this cemetery. You know, the head would usually be facing the west and the feet in the east.
Right.
And so what we have here is kind of a very clear differentiation of what you would find in most cemeteries at that time period. And it really is a setting apart of this space, making it so that there would not be any burials in this area that really is the location of the Irish mass grave.
Come up here to Spring City, another Irish canal workers group all died. You go down, to Downingtown, to another railroad work site, another Irish crew died.
Downingtown is west of Duffy's Cut, and we know from the railroad file and from the evidence from that era that there were laborers who fled the shanty, who tried to get help, and one of them at least went as far west as Downingtown. And that cemetery is called, now it's Northwood Cemetery. But back in the 1830s, it was just a dumping ground, a burial ground, a mass grave site of Irish railroad workers. And what happened was, we believe, a laborer went from Duffy's Cut and infected another work crew with cholera. And this Irish work crew that was out in Downingtown caught the disease, and they ended up dying, sadly, tragically, of the cholera. And they were buried in an unmarked mass grave. And that mass grave site is still in existence. We know for a fact that that area where these Irish laborers were buried has remained untouched since the 1830s. The folklore in the area bore witness to the fact that there was a mass grave. We also know that that it was an area, again, that was untouched in this cemetery. And so we believe that we're going to actually be able to carry on our investigations and look at another cholera grave of Irish laborers who died in 1832.
There's something probably at play that's a little more serious than just a natural disaster in this case. There may have been murders in each of these sites, and precisely because of who they were. Irish, Catholic, poor.
What was just basically the burial ground for a number of years. It eventually became known as Northwood Cemetery. It still exists. And we've talked to some of the folks there over the years, and they were able to help us locate the area where these other Irish laborers were buried.
Well, this is the spot in 1832 where another Irish railroad worker crew perished in the same cholera epidemic and was in fact infected by the men at Duffy's Cut. One of the men from our crew at mile 59 ran west to this exact spot, 11 miles from that site, to mile 48. Contractor Peter Connor here had an Irish railroad workers crew also working on a mile of track. They also died to the last man in the epidemic. That's what we've got in the sources. And so that spot at Duffy's Cut and this spot out here at the present day Northwood Cemetery are connected by the cholera epidemic. We have no way of knowing whether men were also murdered here as they were at Duffy's Cut, but it may be the case that that happened here too.
Whether there was murder at that mile or not, there's a guarantee that the men probably were blamed. They didn't know what caused the disease, so again, it was convenient. They were Irish and Catholic. But this type of scenario is not at all an anomaly. We've been contacted by sites in Virginia, in Maryland, and in Kentucky. Being buried in the fill was fairly common practice. The men were throwaway. So while this is one of the only ones getting major press and a story and the story told, it's certainly not the only one. And it's in the documents that cholera spread, that cholera was at other sites. Whether things were hidden in those documents, we might not know, but we certainly know this is not a unique story unto itself.
You know, and the fill itself, you know, would have been put on top of a culvert that went up in 1831.
Tell me about the significance of the culvert and the stream.
It's called the Valley Creek, and the springs for that creek are about 1/8 of a mile from the Shandy site, you know, and so it would have been not that far away, actually, where somebody would have excreted in that stream in 1832 who had Vibrio cholerae, and our guys would have drank that water and contracted Vibrio cholerae and gotten cholera. And the stream flows through the valley to the north, right under where the tracks are today, of course. The agent of infection for the guys in 1832 at this site was this stream right here, the Valley Creek, which flows eventually into Valley Forge Park. The springs for this body of water are about 1/8 of a mile to my left here, which would be directly to the south of the camp, where this stream flowed through and provided for the men in their camp their fresh water. And in 1832, when Duffy started his work, that culvert, the stone culvert that protects the creek, would have already been constructed, and it would have been something that was required in the whole entire Philadelphia and Columbia line, you know, to protect streams so that farmers can continue to use the water for their crops, you know. And in the case of our particular stream, it was, you know, serving a couple of purposes there, unfortunately. But the culvert was completed in 1831, so when Duffy got there in 1832, basically he just pulled the dirt from the cut into the valley to make the fill. A cut is the gouging out of the landscape to lay the tracks as flat as possible, and then there's a lot of dirt that comes from that, and that's where he made the fill. So we know it is Duffy's Cut, but at the time it would have also been called Duffy's Fill. A fill is just simply a land bridge. So in lieu of a stone bridge, which was much more costly, they constructed the earthen fill. So expertly, actually, that the trains still ride over that fill today. The local inhabitants, where Mile 59 was being constructed, were individuals who would have feared the arrival of cheap Irish labor in the community, people who would have resented the fact that they were taking jobs that they thought ought to be theirs naturally, and people who would have been established here in this area of Chester County probably for some time. Maybe their families were here for a century, you know. People have been, you know, conscious of who they were in relation to these immigrants, thinking that they were superior to these immigrants. And every one of the farming properties nearby, those names are represented on the lists that we have of the East Whiteland Horse Company. I mean, the family that owned Mile 59, where Duffy's Cut is located, was the Pratt family, and they ran the horse company. They were the people who organized it and ran it, and they would have had an Orangeman's consciousness of these Catholic immigrant workers coming into their midst, people who they wouldn't have wanted to be near anyway, and, you know, participating in the economy on a level that they felt should have been theirs.
You get back to work. You get back to work.
Of course, Duffy himself, the contractor, was Catholic. You know, bringing in his fellow countrymen, the whole entire thing was doomed basically from the start when they landed at that particular mile, and cholera broke out because no one was going to help them. People in the horse company would have, as we know from the sources, wanted to create a quarantine, contain them in the valley. And according to the railroad sources, you know, some of the men escaped and were forced back in, you know, in one level of the narrative. We know that they weren't just forced back in, that there was a murder, you know, of course, of these first 7 that occurred off the premises, possibly at the property of the judge, Cromwell Pierce. We know that the judge, Cromwell Pierce, was the chief law officer in the area, okay, and that the horse company was dependent on him, and that they were dependent on him for their activities, you know, that they covered each other. And, you know, for a fact, these guys would have, the Irish immigrants had a consciousness. They didn't want to be hauled in front of somebody with the name Cromwell. It was just a couple centuries earlier, you know, a quarter of the population of the country ends up getting genocidally massacred by Oliver Cromwell. And here they are getting hauled in front of a guy, probably, you know, after having fled the valley, breaking through the quarantine. The railroad sources say that these guys got out of the valley and they were forced back in. Well, it's our thinking they weren't just forced back into the valley. They were brought back in sealed coffins, because we know that each of those coffins had about 100 nails to seal them, way more than you would have needed. All right, and it was to contain and conceal the bloody mess that was inside the coffins, because these guys were murdered bloodily, you know, bloodthirsty, savage kind of scenarios. Vikings, you know, going berserk on these guys. Axe blows to the head, bullets shot in close proximity to the skull, even a woman, you know, getting bludgeoned to death. So they didn't want the remaining railroaders to see what was inside those coffins. The local guys didn't care if our guys lived or died in the valley there, and made sure that the first 7 died. There's no question about that. So they were about as brutal and bloody as they might have been. They imagined themselves to be all prim and proper, you know, in their place in the establishment.
So, Bill, what happened after the first 7 men and women were killed?
The railroad files are very clear that the entire crew of 57 men, and of course a woman, died during the epidemic. Okay, so that they're all going to die, 100% death rate. Typically, it's only 50% from cholera. We figure 2.5, maybe 3 weeks after the first 7 are buried in the fill, they're all dead. Certainly by the end of the summer of 1832, they're all dead.
Well, we know that in addition to the man and the woman that we recovered so far at Duffy's Cut, who are buried in the railroad fill, that there are 50 other men and possibly women who have been left unrecovered there at Duffy's Cut. There are at least 50 other bodies that are still under the ground and are unmourned and unremembered.
You flash forward another 50 years of forgetting what happened there. You know, 50 years of Duffy completely erasing his name from any atrocity there. 50 years of the locals burying that in their attics, in newspapers that were taken from the record, diaries that disappeared. 50 years later, an Irish immigrant named Patrick Doyle, also a Catholic immigrant, came over to the United States in the Civil War, is working for the Pennsylvania Railroad at that time at the exact same place, and found out from his excavation to expand the track line to the north to accommodate larger trains, more modern locomotives, that there are bodies buried in the fill. And all the bodies west of a ravine that is in the middle of the valley are no longer there. All right, we know they were reburied under the line where the stone monument now is. But that stone monument didn't go up until 1909. It was Doyle, back around 1872, who moved those bodies and put up a fence at the current spot where the stone monument is. Passengers on the trains, Amtrak, and the regional SEPTA line can pass that every day, wondering what that thing is, but that is the burial spot of 50 of the 57 workers who were moved in 1872 to the current spot when the dirt was simply excavated for the expansion of the track line to the north. So Doyle found out that there were bodies there, and he found out enough from locals, you know, that he raised some money from the railroaders, Irishmen like himself, to commemorate this story with a wooden fence and a speech. The little ceremony was in the newspapers. Next couple decades, there are stories in the railroad that certain managers wanted to repaint the fence and replace it. And you go ahead to 1909 to 1911, Martin W. Clement is the assistant director of the railroad in Paoli. He's like a supervisor, you can call him, for the Paoli area, living on the site of Immaculata University with the Donahue family. Bridget Donahue, her maiden name was Doyle, was the sister of Patrick Doyle, and would have told Clement about what her brother had done there, you know, some years earlier. And so he took it on himself to replace the wooden fence, which always needed to be repaired, with a stone monument which still stands at the site. And he also began trying to collect details of the story from older railroaders. He put articles even in the newspapers, ads, saying, does anyone have any information? And that's how we know how some of these documents telling the story have disappeared, because there's reference to them in the railroad file, diaries, newspaper stories, and so on, that there were things done by Clement, and there were things that Clement could not do. You know, he made the file, he rebuilt the wall, but he was not allowed by the railroad to put a plaque on the spot commemorating exactly what happened. And then by the time he rose to the ranks of the railroad to become the vice president, he's later the president, it was off limits to the public. The file that he collected with documents, off limits to the public. They didn't want the story to, quote, get out of the office, because it was bad public relations for the railroad, and it probably was very bad public relations for the families in Chester County who had risen to prominence within the political system, and who didn't want that story out there.
Bill, tell us a little bit about the discovery of the Duffy's Cut file and what exactly that set in motion.
Well, the file that Martin Clement created in 1909 contained basically all of the context for what happened to the men and the woman at Duffy's Cut in 1832. It was the only piece of evidence that could tell the entire story. And it was kept secret for a lot of years. It was marked off limits to the public and was very rarely brought out and shown to anyone. How we got a hold of this was an amazing coincidence. That my grandfather happened to be Martin Clement's executive assistant and was a kind of historian for the Pennsylvania Railroad. You know, was a keeper of a lot of the details that the company wanted kept. And he retired as director of personnel. His name was Joseph Trippeson. When the railroad went out of business after merging with the New York Central, there was an auction that had almost all their documents for auction, for sale, except that file, because my grandfather got it out of the vault before the auction happened, because he took an interest in the story and probably wanted to do, you know, just do what he could to keep the story alive. It might have just been buried. I mean, the whole story might have been buried along with the men, were it not for that fact. My brother obtained that from our grandmother in the 1980s. I didn't know about it. I mean, I have some vague recollections that my brother has more vivid recollections of our grandfather talking about the story, but it didn't mean anything to me until I took a look at that file in 2002 at my brother's house, and my eyes bulged out of my head by simply realizing where it was, because it said between Malvern and Fraser. That's where I work at Immaculata. And certain details inside the file about ghost stories and so on that just sort of resonated to me, that I said, look, we've got to start doing something with this. But it was a coincidence, A, of the file in my family being passed down, and B, that I worked about a minute from the site. Wow. It's a crazy set of circumstances, which I don't think are just a coincidence.
Initially, the Duffy's Cut project was really an historical archival type project. We spent the first 3 or 4 years primarily working with documents, going to different historical societies, newspaper archives. But in around the year 2005, we started to move into the archaeology. We were looking primarily for the mass grave. But as secondary, we were also looking for the grave of the individuals who had died, and then the actual work camp of the men at Duffy's Cut. We were very lucky within about a year, we were able to locate the work camp of the men. Within that work camp, we found many different artifacts. As historians, what we did in our archival work was to uncover the story as it had been written down. But when we moved from the archives into the archaeology, what we needed to do is uncover what was there and find out if what we found matched what was written. And the first artifact that we actually did find was a large cooking pot. It was under 8 inches of subsoil, and it still sat on the charcoal where it had last been used. Now we know, and this was extremely exciting because we know from the archives that the blacksmith was ordered to hide everything by burning and or burying what was left of our men's possessions.
I pulled this out from an area that had a spring very close to the shanty. And so we presume this is the area where the men were cooking at the time. And this was buried with a lot of charcoal beneath it, indicating that it was buried in haste.
For there to be a working cooking pot still sitting on the ashes under 8 inches of subsoil is something we would never find anywhere unless there was something that went drastically wrong. So that was a first very exciting artifact find. Now the second thing that we found
in very close proximity to that is a pipe stem with the name of the city, Derry, on it. Now this is important because it indicates a point of origin for our crew, and the fact that it is the only pipe stem with a city name on it is very important, because the ship that we were able to locate that brought the men in was the John Stamp. The railroad file indicates the arrival time for the ship as the summer, right before the crew got to work.
Now, this is not unexpected to find in a work camp in 1832. What is unexpected is if you understand how a pipe is smoked in 1832, and especially by very poor people, each time you use it, you break off a very small tip of the end. And you do this because it gets disgusting after a while, having been in your mouth. So what you would expect to find is very small pieces of pipe stem, and when they're finished, you're going to have a pipe bowl with a small stem left attached to it. That's not what we found. What we found was very large pieces of pipe stem. Now this is indicative of those pipes being thrown into a fire when they were still usable. And you would never find that in a work crew who can't barely afford their pipe. So we're finding large stems, which tells us something went wrong here. Within that same burn pattern in the burn field, we found buttons.
It's a button that may have been from a haversack. Would not have been uncommon for workers at that time to have had a sack by their side, maybe containing a morsel of food, something they might have needed for their construction purposes. And this man was buried not only with a knife, but probably with a haversack, indicating some kind of unusual burial, because this is the kind of item that would have been removed from the body under normal circumstances.
These buttons would have been extremely valuable to our men. They only had a couple of shirts, so you might find a button on a work camp, but you won't find a dozen buttons in a work camp unless something went wrong, especially concentrated in one small area. We also found silverware, forks. You would never find forks left behind in a work camp, unless perhaps they had been broken. We didn't find broken forks. We found a number of forks that had been in a fire and burned. So all of these artifacts lent themselves perfectly to the story that we had uncovered in the archives. And it told us that, for the most part, what we had read and what had been recorded was true, which that allowed us to then say, if that part of the story is true, then where is the mass grave? Because there must be a mass grave and there must be individual graves. And that kept us going. In about 3.5 years of that archaeological work, we were able to find the first body of John Ruddy. And that changed the dynamic of the Duffy's Cut dig completely, because now we took it from artifacts to actual bones. We took what we believed were murders, and we actually had the bones and the skulls to prove those murders. So that's where everything exploded when we found the first man.
What can the excavated remains tell us about the Duffy's Cut workers?
You can gather myriad information from the excavated remains. We can learn about where they come from. We can learn about their ages, their gender, their diets. We can learn about how they lived because of things like the muscle attachments. Manual laborers, muscle responds to demand, so manual laborers will have greater muscle mass and they'll have larger muscle attachments on their skeletons. you can, again, diet. We know that the Duffy's Cut victims did not have access to sugar. They didn't have a lot of dental decay. We know that we can estimate their ages from their dentition and from their bones. We can learn how tall they are from their bones, especially the thigh bone. We can tell about the way they lived. Most of the remains that we found were laborers. We can tell things about the way they died.
Okay.
We have seen skull wounds that haven't had time. They're perimortem wounds, meaning right around the time of death. They haven't had time for the bone to knit back together. So there's an awful lot that you can learn from those excavated remains.
We used just about every tool in the geophysicist's toolbox. We did some ground-penetrating radar surveys. It's like the radar used to track airplanes, but a much lower frequency so that it penetrates the earth, not just through air. So we did a complete mapping of the valley with ground-penetrating radar. We found a number of features that were then excavated using radar. What really helped us find the bodies was electrical resistivity imaging. We shot electric currents through the earth between pairs of electrodes, and at electrodes at different spacings and in different locations, and it's a little bit like doing a CAT scan with electrical currents. So we built a 3D image of what was underground and found this highly resistive zone, which was the string of 7 caskets that had collapsed, leaving air spaces behind. We also, to decipher this story of what happened to the embankment and where we think they are now, we did a seismic survey to look at the soils in the valley to see if we could discriminate the embankment material from just natural soils, and we could very clearly. So we have great cross-sectional images of the 1832 embankment, and we can see the embankment is there, and we reach the end of it, and it's just natural soils. So it's proof that they were robbing the fill, they were robbing the embankment in 1870 to straighten the railroad. Once we had this hypothesis that the mass grave had been found and reburied where they were working in 1870 and a wall put over it, we went up and did geophysics at the wall to see if we could see evidence of the reburial. And we think we see that. We have another 3D electrical image that has an anomaly at about 35 feet down that is partially within the modern stone wall, but then extends towards the existing R5 tracks, towards the active R5 tracks. So it's a pretty large anomaly, and we see it with electrical resistivity, and we also see it seismically. There's very low seismic velocity material there. So sort of what you'd expect for organic material that has decayed. It's tough to call these poor men organic material, but that's what they were. So these victims have decayed and left behind a spot that's resistive and low seismic velocity.
I first learned about it back in the early 2000s, not long after the team had first gone out to dig. I spent a lot of time there, not nearly as much time as the team, but a lot of time, relatively speaking, with the people who were digging. We did stories where the only things that these team members came back with were blisters on their hands and frustration in their hearts. There was digging, there were arguments, there were heated discussions, and more than anything, when you went out to the site, you got a feeling. I don't know where part of that feeling came from. I do know that part of the feeling was the faith, not in a religious sense, but in a belief sense, that what they, and ultimately, as I joined the team, what we were looking for.
Well, if the body's under there, we got it now.
Were real people who had disappeared under the absolute worst of circumstances and whose deaths, under horrible conditions, in the eyes of those responsible, would have remained unknown, unsolved, anonymous forever, were it not for these wonderful team members.
The first body we found was John Ruddy. We found him under the tree. Then we started developing certain mapped areas to establish where we could find more bodies and more artifacts. And then as the dig went along, we found more key pieces of evidence of where we were was the shanty.
Okay.
Because we found pocket knives, we found buttons, and one of the biggest significant pieces of evidence that I thought was the pipe.
You were one of the crew members for the Duffy's Cut dig. Tell me about how that whole crew came about.
A lot of us volunteered to be part of it because we were history majors, and the significance behind reburying these guys meant something to any one of us because we all had some link to an Irish heritage, even though our grandparents were born here and we were born here. And a lot of us got together to rally around Doc Watson because he started this all. Him, Frank, Earl, and Tom Connor, they started all this. And to be a part of this and rally around Doc, it was more like a camaraderie. Like we go here, we dig, we find artifacts, we try to uncover things, but the main thing was to rebury these guys in a dignified manner.
Why do you feel that it was important to bring Catherine Burns back home to be buried?
To make the people of Ireland and of Tyrone aware that these events took place and the difficulties surrounding the travels, especially in the pre-famine and post-famine era. And it's also necessary to bring her to perhaps her own home parish, hometown land. That proved difficult, and I contacted Bill Watson to perhaps find out if we could have her interred in another part of Tyrone, and he agreed. I was able to contact Father Fee, who's a friend of the family, and he agreed to have her buried in a parish called Clonaux in the southeastern part of Tyrone.
The great Last Judgment
the
story.
The small town of Clonaux in County Tyrone, typical Irish small town village, very strong community, very tight-knit community. When we arrived there, they knew obviously well in advance we were coming. I think our first night there, they held a fesh, basically in our honor, just as a celebration, as a way to welcome us and to show their appreciation for what we were doing there.
When I had made the trip to Ireland with Vince, I felt it really important. It was a historical moment, I thought, we were taking place when we buried the remains of Catherine Burns.
To you, O Lord, we commend the soul of Catherine, your servant. The sight of this world, she is now dead. In your sight, may she live forever.
Unfortunately, I videotaped it and had a great reaction from the crowd there. The people that attended, the Donegal Society, they were there. And it was very important for the people in Philadelphia, the Irish community in Philadelphia, to get a taste of the real history of what it's all about, the immigration and the struggles that they went through. You couldn't get any more of a struggle than what the Duffy's Cut folks went through. It was unbelievable if you read the story and you know the story. It's unbelievable that they can come off a boat and be dead in less than 2 months, and when they're trying to find freedom. The Duffy's Cut story seems to have resonated among a lot of people in the Philadelphia area Irish community. And a number of individuals over the years have come forward to help out in some remarkable ways with things that we really needed help on, and we had no other way of obtaining such help. Kathy Burns, who was in the Donegal Society and who was the president of the St. Patrick's Day Parade.
You know, I think it was predestined that I would be involved with the legend of Duffy's Cut. One day my friend Jimmy Meehan came to me and he said, you know, Kath, I think there's something you should know about that's happening in Immaculata. And then he sat and told me about the Watson brothers and Duffy's Cut and the situation that was going on there. And I said, wow, something just took hold of me. We invited them up to the Donegal Society where they asked for money for their project. It was a struggle from day one for them, and it still is. But they came to Donegal, asked for the money, and they got $1,000, which was wonderful. But also they got me, and I'm happy that that happened.
When it comes to Duffy's Cut, I didn't choose to get involved. Duffy's Cut captured me.
To know that these men and women had come over from Ireland and basically were forgotten here, and more than forgotten, were mistreated to the nth degree.
It's very important that we finish up at Duffy's Cut and make every effort to retrieve whatever remnants are left of the bodies there. And I know Professor Watson wants to make sure that there's no possibility of leaving anyone behind, and we can move on to the two other sites, and we're more than likely going to go through the same situation.
It's important to both us as people who benefited from their hard work and to those that were still wondering what happened to them. Believe it or not, they've got people in Ireland, family members, that are still wondering. The letters stopped. They had, these are their great uncles that they never heard from again, that were mysteries in the family. I think it's very important to finish their story and to do right by them once and for all.
We're looking for people to help people who were murdered in the 1800s. We're the only ones they have left. Somebody needs to help them. We need you to help, and we're going to help as well, because that'll chronicle history for us, for the future generations, so they know how hard the Irish had when they came here to take jobs that should not have been that dangerous.
A kind of historic memory is very important among the Irish. All the hardships and turmoil over the years having been conquered and subjected to inhumane treatment, and making it over here in the United States, getting a piece of the American dream, and then finding out that America, in some cases, in some circumstances, is not too different from the horrors that they left behind. And that's basically the story of Duffy's Cut. The story of individuals who came over for the American dream and who thought that this was a society that wouldn't have the same kind of stratified ways of looking at people. People at the bottom of the hierarchy versus people at the top of the hierarchy. And by God, the same stuff happened here as happened in Ireland. And the deaths of the Duffy's Cut men and women, I think, resonated among the Irish in the Delaware Valley because it's something they could all relate to. It's something that was in their own family's past back in the old country. And you hope that, that in the future that wouldn't happen over here, but by God, it did happen over here. And it pissed enough people off that they got involved.
Really at the heart of this is to recover all of those who died at Duffy's Cut. Everyone deserves to be remembered. Everyone deserves to have their story told. And that's what we want to do. We want to recover the rest of those who are still buried at Duffy's Cut.
Irish immigrants sailed away from Derry's Quay on a ship they call the Johnstown, far to cross the Atlantic Sea. But their hopes and dreams and their broken bones never made it back. They lie beneath the earth at Duffy's Cut, down beside the railway track. From Philadelphia to Pittsburgh, oh, the railway line would run. Some say they died from fever, while others say the gun. Was there poison in the water? Did they come under attack? They lie beneath the earth at Duffy's Cut, down beside the railway track. Well, John Ruddy was just 18 years. He came from Donegal. No one knows how he met his end.